At 34, she owned nothing but $11 and a name no one respected anymore. We begin, as we always do, with the truth of it, plain and unhurried. At 34 years old, Adelene Marsh stood on a rutted road in eastern Kansas with $11 sewn into her hem, a carpetbag holding everything she owned, and nowhere on this earth that would call itself home. Her husband's brother, a hard and calculating man named Silas Marsh, had stood in the doorway of the farmhouse she had scrubbed and loved for 9 years and told her, without so much as lowering his voice, that the land belonged to him now by right of unpaid debts her late husband had never mentioned, and that she had until sundown to be gone. She did not argue. She had learned, in a life that had already asked more of her than most, that arguing with a man who has already decided is like arguing with weather. So she walked, and after 3 days of walking and one night sleeping beneath a wagon at a toll gate, she arrived in a modest water-starved town called Cedar Hollow, where a notice nailed to the courthouse door announced a tax auction of abandoned properties. Among them, listed last, dismissed by the auctioneer in a single breath, was a burned-out homestead at the edge of town, its house nothing but a blackened chimney and a cellar full of ash, unwanted by every soul present. She paid $30 for it, nearly all she had left in the world, and the men around her laughed, quietly, the way men laugh at a woman who has clearly lost her sense along with her home. She did not know, as she signed her name to that deed, that sealed beneath the ruin of that homestead lay a secret that had been waiting 8 years to be found, one that would not only change the course of her own life, but would give an entire forgotten town back something it had been mourning in silence since the fire that took it all. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelene Marsh, if you are watching this from a town that the world seems to have passed by, or from a place that feels like it's been forgotten on some larger map. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to know. We're not the only ones who still believe forgotten places matter. Adelene had not always been a woman without a name that mattered. She had been born Adelene Foster, in a river town in Ohio, the only daughter of a quiet, meticulous man named Elias Foster, who made his living as a land surveyor for the county and in his spare hours, as something the town considered half eccentric and half essential, a water diviner, a reader of land, a man who could walk a field with a forked hazel branch and tell you, with unsettling accuracy, where the earth held its secrets close. Adelene had grown up at his elbow, carrying his chains and stakes, learning to read a contour line the way other girls learned embroidery. Her mother had died when she was 9, and in the quiet after that loss, her father had simply folded her into his work rather than send her away to relatives. And so she had grown up fluent in a language most women of her era were never taught, the language of elevation and drainage, of where water wants to go and where it is forced to go instead, of how a landscape remembers what has been done to it long after the people who did it are dead. Her father used to tell her, standing over some drought-cracked field, that land never lies, even when the men who own it do. She had believed him with the whole unshaken faith of a child, and later, with the tempered faith of a grown woman who had watched the principle prove itself again and again. When she was 22, she had married John Marsh, a gentle, sun-browned young man from Kansas who had come east to buy surveying equipment from her father's shop and had stayed, in the end, to court his daughter instead. They had built a life together on a modest homestead outside Cedar Hollow, John farming what the land would give him, Adelene keeping the accounts and, more quietly, keeping the peace with his older brother Silas, a man whose ambitions had always run larger than his conscience. For 9 years, it had been, if not an easy life, an honest one. The kind of life built from small, accumulating faithfulness rather than any single dramatic happiness. She had learned to can peaches and deliver a breech calf and stretch $1 until it groaned. And she had learned, above all, patience, the particular patience of a woman who understands that most worthwhile things reveal themselves slowly to those willing to keep looking. It was a virtue she had no idea she would soon need more than she had ever needed anything. The fall came, as it so often does, not as a single blow, but as a slow accumulation of smaller ones that only later revealed themselves as a single collapse. First came 2 years of drought so severe that the creek behind their farm, a creek that had run steady since anyone could remember, thinned to a trickle, and then, in the second summer, vanished from its bed entirely, leaving cracked mud where cattle used to drink. John, never a man to admit defeat, borrowed against the farm to dig a well, then borrowed again when the well came up dry at 40 feet. Convinced that persistence alone would find water where geology had not provided any. Adelene had studied the land with her father's old habits and told him, gently, that the well was in the wrong place, that the water table beneath their particular acreage sloped away toward the old Hollis property at the edge of town rather than toward their own soil. But John, exhausted and frightened in the particular way that proud men become frightened, had trusted the well-digger's confidence over his wife's careful reading of contouring clay. The debts mounted. Then, in the bitter cold of the following winter, John caught a fever that started as a cough and ended 3 weeks later, with Adeline sitting beside a bed that had gone quiet, holding a hand that no longer held hers back. She grieved in the only way the situation allowed her to, quickly, because grief was a luxury the situation would not fund. Silas arrived within the month, not to comfort her, but to inform her that John's debts, all of them, had been secured against the farm itself, and that as the only surviving Marsh male in the county, he intended to take possession before the county could seize it for taxes instead. Adeline had asked with what dignity she had left to see the paperwork, and Silas had shown her documents bearing signatures that looked correct and dates that felt somehow slightly wrong, though she could not have said precisely why. She had no money for a lawyer and no family left to advocate for her, and so, on a gray March morning, she had packed what fit in a single carpetbag and walked away from the only home she had built as a grown woman. With $11 to her name and a silence in her chest where a future used to be, she might have gone east, back toward Ohio, toward whatever remained of her father's memory in that river town. Instead, something in her, call it stubbornness, call it her father's old belief that land never lies even when people do, made her stay near Cedar Hollow, close enough to watch the notice board outside the courthouse, where county auctions of tax-delinquent properties were posted for anyone desperate or foolish enough to bid on them. It was there, on a cold Tuesday morning with a wind that cut through her coat like a blade, that she saw the listing for the old Hollis homestead, 11 acres at the northern edge of town. Structure destroyed by fire in 1878, sold as is, minimum bid $30. The auctioneer, a portly man named Pruitt, who clearly considered the whole exercise beneath him, read the listing in the flattest voice imaginable and looked directly at Adeline when he asked if anyone present would take it off the county's hands. The men around her, 3 farmers, a mill clerk, and a banker's assistant, all shook their heads. some of them laughing under their breath at the idea that anyone would want a burned ruin at the edge of a dying town. A property everyone in Cedar Hollow had quietly called cursed since the fire 8 years before, when its owner, an old widower named Thomas Hollis, had vanished the very same night the flames took his house, never to be seen in the county again. Adelene thought of her $11, thought of the cold nights ahead with nothing but a carpetbag between her and the world, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that a burned home was still technically a roof over a cellar, and a cellar was still technically shelter. She raised her hand. Pruitt blinked, recovered, and sold her 11 acres and a ruin for $30, which took every cent she had except for the change in her coat pocket. The men around her did laugh then, openly, and one of them, a heavy-set farmer named Otis Grayle, remarked loudly enough for her to hear that the widow, Marsh, had gone from losing one homestead to buying herself a grave. She said nothing. She only signed the deed, tucked it into her bag beside her father's old surveying compass, the one possession from her old life she had refused to leave behind, and began the long walk north to see, with her own eyes, exactly what $30 desperate had bought her. What she found when she arrived was worse and better than she had expected in equal measure. The house itself was gone entirely save for a blackened stone chimney standing alone like a tombstone against the sky, and the ground around it was a wreck of charred timber, ash gone hard as clay from years of rain, and a cellar hole half collapsed and choked with debris. But the land itself, and here her father's training rose up in her like an old friend returning, the land itself was good. She could read it even in ruin, a gentle southward slope, soil dark and undisturbed beyond the burn scar. And something else, something she felt rather than measured, a faint coolness in the air near the northeast corner of the property that her father had taught her, years ago, to associate with water moving somewhere beneath the surface. She set up a crude camp in the least damaged corner of the cellar that first night, using boards from the collapsed barn to keep the wind off, and told herself, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has nothing left to lose, that she would at least see what the ruin held before she judged it worthless. The first days were consumed by simple survival, clearing enough of the cellar to make it livable, walking 2 miles to the nearest well for water, trading needlework to a shopkeeper's wife for a little flour and lard. It was on the 4th day, while clearing ash and fallen stone from around the base of the old chimney to build herself a proper hearth, that her shovel struck something that did not sound like stone. She dug carefully, her heart beginning to beat in a way it had not beaten since before John's death, and uncovered a small iron strongbox, its surface scorched black but its seams intact, clearly placed there deliberately in the chimney's foundation, by someone who wanted it protected from exactly the kind of fire that had consumed everything else. She pried it open with the edge of her shovel, her hands unsteady, and found inside a single object wrapped in a scorched oilcloth, a hand-drawn map, its edges burned into lace-like fragility, its ink faded but legible, showing the Hollis property and the surrounding hills in careful surveyor's detail, the same careful detail her own father had once used. At the bottom, in a shaking hand very different from the confident lines of the map itself, someone had written a single phrase that would haunt her for weeks afterward. For whoever finds this, it leads to nowhere, and everywhere. Forgive me. She sat with that map for a long time that evening, turning it in the firelight, and understood with growing unease that could only be Thomas Hollis, the very man who had vanished the night this house burned. The map itself seemed, at first glance, almost mocking in its uselessness. It marked no buried gold, no hidden strongbox of coin, nothing a treasure hunter's heart might crave. Instead, it showed, in exacting detail, the original course of Cedar Creek as it had run through the county 30 years before. A course that bore almost no resemblance to the creek's current. Diminished path, the very creek whose disappearance had driven her own husband to dig a well in the wrong place and drown them both in debt. Where the modern creek thinned to nothing east of town, the old map showed it running full and strong through a natural limestone channel that passed directly beneath the Hollis property itself, feeding what the map labeled in Thomas Hollis's careful hand as the spring house sealed. Adelene's father had taught her enough hydrology in the years she'd spent as his shadow to understand immediately what she was looking at. This was not a map to nowhere at all. It was a map to the town's original water source, a natural spring that had once fed Cedar Hollow's creek before some deliberate act of engineering had diverted it elsewhere, leaving the town's farmers and families to struggle against a drought that, according to this map, was not entirely nature's doing. She spent the following days doing what her father had trained her to do since childhood, walking the land with patient, methodical attention, comparing the old map against the terrain as it existed now, noting where the modern creek bed diverged from the ancient course the map described. And slowly, the shape of a deeper mystery began to reveal itself. Roughly 2 miles east of the Hollis homestead, where the map showed the creek curving naturally around a limestone outcrop, she found instead an artificial earthen embankment, decades old but unmistakably man-made, that forced the water into a narrower channel running directly toward the property of Cedar Hollow's largest landowner, a man named Cornelius Vance, who operated the town's gristmill and, more importantly, controlled the only reliable water rights in the county through a company he had quietly incorporated years before under the name Cedar Hollow Water and Milling Concern. She began asking careful questions at the general store and the church social, framing her curiosity as simple newcomer's interest, and learned, piece by piece, from an elderly woman named Mrs. Odessa Vane, who remembered the town's earlier days, that Thomas Hollis had once been Cedar Hollow's most respected citizen, not a farmer at all, but the surveyor who had platted the original town and its water rights, a man who had some 30 years prior discovered and mapped the natural spring beneath his own land as a resource meant to belong to the whole community. Mrs. Vane recalled, in a lowered voice, that there had been a bitter dispute in the years before the fire, a dispute over whether the spring and its water rights belonged to the town collectively or could be claimed as private property by whoever controlled the land above it, a dispute that had ended, mysteriously and conveniently, when the creek's course was altered for flood control, diverting the water toward what would become Vance's mill instead. And when, not long after, Thomas Hollis's home burned in the night and the old man himself disappeared, leaving no body, no explanation, and no further objection to the arrangement that followed, Adeline understood, holding that fragile burned map in her hands, that she was not looking at a curiosity from a dead man's confused final hours. She was looking at evidence, a surveyor's precise, professional documentation of exactly how the water had been stolen from an entire town, sealed away and hidden by a man who had perhaps paid too dear a price for trying to protect it, and left quite deliberately, for whoever might one day be desperate enough and patient enough To dig through the ashes and find it. It did not take long for Adelene's careful questions to draw attention she had not sought. Cornelius Vance was not a man who tolerated curiosity about his water rights. And within 2 weeks of her arrival, he called on her himself. Arriving at the burned homestead in a fine black buggy, entirely unsuited to the rutted approach. Dressed with the particular polish of a man who wanted to be underestimated for his manners rather than his intentions. He was courteous in the manner of men who have never needed to be anything else, offering her, with apparent generosity, $40 for the property, a $10 profit on her purchase, more money than she'd seen in months, explaining that the land held sentimental value to him, given his old friendship with poor departed Thomas Hollis, and that he hated to see a widow struggling on a ruined homestead when he could relieve her of the burden entirely. Adelene, who had spent 9 years learning to read the accounts of men who wanted something and dressed it as kindness, declined politely, citing her attachment to having a place of her own, however humble. Vance's courtesy cooled by several degrees at her refusal, and he left with a warning wrapped in pleasantries, observing that burned properties were unlucky, that the townsfolk already whispered about the widow living alone in a ruin, and that a woman without protection in a hard county ought to consider her safety as well as her pride. The pressure that followed was not violent, but it was relentless in the particular, suffocating way that small-town power exerts itself. The shopkeeper who had traded her flour for needlework suddenly found his shelves too bare to spare any. A farmer who'd offered her the loan of a mule for plowing withdrew the offer without explanation. And Otis Grayle, the same man who had mocked her at the auction, began telling anyone who'd listen that the widow Marsh had gone strange in her grief, wandering the burned property at odd hours, talking to herself, digging where no sane person would dig. Adelene recognized the pattern for what it was, not organic gossip but a deliberate campaign. The kind a man like Vance could orchestrate through a handful of favors owed and debts called in, designed to isolate her, to make her doubt her own judgment, to make the eventual sale of her useless, cursed little ruin feel like a mercy rather than a surrender. She might have succumbed to it in a weaker season of her life, but she had already survived the loss of a husband, a home, and nearly every certainty she'd built her adulthood upon. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had very little fear left to spend on a man's disapproval. Instead, she did what her father had taught her to do with any problem too large to solve by force. She measured it. She spent her days, while the whispers grew louder in town, walking the old creek course with her father's compass and a borrowed chain, driving stakes at precise intervals, recording elevations in a notebook bought with the last of her egg money, building, patiently, meticulously, the way she had built everything worthwhile in her life, an actual surveyor's case. A document that did not merely allege wrongdoing, but proved it in the language every county clerk and judge would be forced to recognize. She found the sealed Spring House on a rain-softened morning in late April, exactly where Thomas Hollis's map indicated it should be, buried beneath a slope of blackberry bramble and collapsed limestone that had clearly been arranged, decades before, to conceal rather than merely to erode. It took her 3 days of careful digging, alone, her hands blistered and her back aching in a way that would have frightened her in her old life, and now simply felt like proof of purpose, to clear enough stone to reveal a hand-built limestone archway sealed with mortared rubble, behind which she could hear, faint but unmistakable, the sound of running water. She did not break the seal alone, some instinct, some inherited caution from her father's careful habits, told her this discovery needed witnesses before it needed excavation. So she walked into Cedar Hollow that same afternoon, ash still under her fingernails, and asked the one man in town she believed might still weigh evidence over rumor, the circuit judge, Elias Boone, who was due to hold court in the county 3 days hence, and who, when she laid Thomas Hollis's burned map and her own careful survey notes before him on his hotel room desk, went very quiet and then very still, and then asked her, in a voice suddenly stripped of all formality, whether she understood exactly what she was accusing Cornelius Vance of having done. She told him she understood perfectly, and that she had not come to accuse anyone of anything, only to ask that the county's own surveyor confirm what her measurements already showed, that the original water rights of Cedar Hollow, platted 3 decades earlier by Thomas Hollis himself and recorded, she now knew from further digging in the courthouse archive, in a county ledger that predated the current altered records by 12 years, entitled The Spring and Its Flow to the Town Collectively, not to whoever happened to own the mill downstream of a diverted creek. Judge Boone, to his credit, did not delay. He ordered the county surveyor to accompany Adelene to the site within the week, and word of the impending inspection moved through Cedar Hollow faster than any fire ever had. Cornelius Vance did not go quietly. He arrived at the Hollis homestead the morning before the survey was to take place, this time without his fine buggy, arriving instead on horseback with 2 hired men who made no effort to disguise their purpose. And he told Adelene plainly that the old records she'd found were void superseded, meaningless scraps that no court would honor over 30 years of established use, and that she would be wise to abandon her foolish crusade before she found herself, like Thomas Hollis before her, without a home at all. It was the wrong thing to say, and Adelene understood immediately that it was also, unwittingly, a confession. No innocent man threatens a widow with the fate of a man he claims not to have wronged. She told him with a steadiness that surprised even her, that she intended to be present when the county surveyor arrived, and that if anything happened to her before then, the judge already held copies of everything she had found, and every soul in Cedar Hollow would know exactly whose name belonged beside the question of what happened to Thomas Hollis. Vance left without another word, and though the days that followed were tense, no further harm came to her, whether from conscience or calculation, she never fully knew. Though she suspected the latter, the county surveyor arrived 4 days later, accompanied by Judge Boone himself, along with a small crowd of curious townsfolk who had heard, by then, enough fragments of the story to abandon whatever chores could wait. They broke the mortared seal of the spring house together, Adelene standing beside men who had laughed at her $30 purchase 2 months before. And when the last stones fell away, clean, cold water surged forth in a volume that made several onlookers gasp aloud. Water that had been trapped and redirected for 8 long years, while the town above it withered in a drought that had never been entirely natural at all. The surveyor's measurements, taken over the following 2 days, confirmed everything Adeline's own patient work had already shown. The embankment 2 miles east was artificial, deliberately constructed, and the original 1858 county water rights ledger, which Adelene had located in an uncatalogued box in the courthouse basement, named the spring as common property of Cedar Hollow's founding settlement, a designation that had somehow conveniently gone missing from later official records. Right around the same year, the creek was diverted and Thomas Hollis vanished. Judge Boone, presented with evidence too precise and too documented to dismiss, ordered the embankment breached and the water rights restored to the town under a public trust, and opened, simultaneously, a formal inquiry into the disappearance of Thomas Hollis 8 years prior. An inquiry that would eventually, through testimony from a fearful former hired hand of Vance's, reveal that the old surveyor had been driven from his own burning home that night rather than perishing in it, last seen fleeing north with nothing but the clothes on his back, and had, as far as anyone could later determine, spent his remaining years living humbly and namelessly in a river town some 100 miles distant, never returning, never reclaiming what had been his. Content, it seemed, simply to have hidden the truth where someone patient enough might one day find it. Cornelius Vance, facing a mounting public inquiry. The restoration of water rights he had profited from for years, and testimony that grew more damning by the week, quietly sold his milling concern and left the county before the summer's end, his name becoming, in Cedar Hollow, a byword for the particular quiet justice that catches up to men who believe patience belongs only to their victims. And so we return, as we promised, to where we began, to a woman standing on a cold road with $11 and no home, who was mocked for spending her last $30 on a burned ruin nobody else would touch. Adelene Marsh did not restore that spring for wealth, though the town, in its gratitude, saw to it that her small homestead was never again short of anything she needed. And she did not seek revenge against Silas, the brother-in-law who had cast her out, though word of her discovery reached him eventually, and he never dared show his face in Cedar Hollow again. His own fraudulent claim to John's old farm, quietly unraveling under a scrutiny he had never expected his sister-in-law to survive long enough to invite. What she wanted, in the end, was only what her father had taught her to value above all else in a life spent reading land other people had given up on: the truth. The ground itself was still willing to tell, if someone was patient enough to listen. She rebuilt her small home at the edge of the restored creek, using stone from the very chimney that had once hidden Thomas Hollis's secret, and she became, in time, the closest thing Cedar Hollow had to what her father had once been to their old Ohio river town. A woman other people brought their disputes and their droughts and their forgotten deeds to, trusting that she would read the land honestly, whatever the cost of the truth turned out to be. The $30 she had spent on a ruin everyone called worthless had bought, in the end, not a home at all, but a restoration of water, of memory, and of a good man's name that had waited 8 patient years in the ashes to be spoken again. Thank you for spending this time with Adeline and with us. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things are not always worthless things, and that patience, more often than we admit, is its own quiet kind of courage. Before you go, we'd love to ask you something in the comments below. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off?